whether you want a blurred background or a sharp image from front to back. There are three key variables that control depth of field: aperture, focal length, and subject distance. Aren't you a little close? We're going to cover how to manipulate each of these three variables with real-world examples. But first, what exactly is depth of field? Depth of field, put simply, is the zone of acceptable sharpness in an image. Let's look at an example. The focus point for this shot was on this white pawn, and everything at that exact distance is perfectly sharp as expected. The focused area is not just a point, but a plane in front of the camera. Notice how the chess piece is still in focus when I move it in line with the plane of focus. Also notice that the pawn on the other side of the board is in focus as well. As you move away from the plane of focus, either away from the camera or closer to it, the sharpness gradually drops off until the image appears blurred to the human eye. The total distance between the nearest and furthest points that still appear sharp is what we call depth of field. This zone of acceptable sharpness is dependent on what the human eye perceives as sharp. For example, a small image on your phone might look sharp, but the same image as a large print on the wall might reveal more blur. A good rule of thumb is that depth of field is about 1/3 in front of the focus point and 2/3 behind it in most situations. The most well-known way to control depth of field is with aperture. Aperture's main job is controlling the amount of light entering the lens, but it also has a huge impact on depth of field. A wide aperture, like f2.8, lets in a lot of light and creates a shallow depth of field. A small aperture, like f16, reduces light, but also increases depth of field, keeping more of the image sharp. Watch what happens when we only change the aperture, while keeping our focal length and subject distance the same. Here's another example of the same thing. Another way to control depth of field is by adjusting how close you are to the subject you're focused on. The closer you are, the shallower the depth of field. Watch how depth of field increases as I move away from the subject. This also happens when I stay in one spot and move my point of focus further out into the scene. As the distance between our lens and point of focus gets larger, depth of field increases dramatically. This is why landscape shots taken at a distance are often sharp throughout, even at moderate apertures, while macro shots often have an extremely shallow depth of field because the camera is very close to the subject. Focal length also plays a major role in depth of field. For practical purposes, you can think of longer focal lengths, like telephoto lenses, as reducing depth of field, and wide-angle lenses as increasing it. But first, let's make sure we understand what focal length is. Put simply, focal length is the distance between the lens and the sensor or the film, when the lens is focused to infinity. But thankfully, we don't need to calculate that ourselves. All modern lenses should have focal length marked on them. The larger our focal length, the narrower the field of view. You can think of it as how zoomed in the image looks. The change in depth of field due to focal length actually stems from differences in physical aperture size. If you're interested in exploring the technical details, make sure to subscribe for a future video that will dive deeper on this topic. Notice how the depth of field increases as I reduce the focal length, or zoom out. In this example, both images are taken with the same aperture, but at 70 millimeters, the background blur is more intense than at 35 millimeters. However, these are very different images. Our subject is taking up twice as much of the frame in the image taken with a 70 millimeter focal length. If we move further away from our subject to maintain the same size across images, the depth of field remains the same. Look at these two shots, one at 35 millimeters and one at 70 millimeters. I took a few steps back for the 70 millimeter shot, and as you can see, the background blur is nearly identical. However, there's another effect at play here. The background in the 70 millimeter shot appears much more zoomed in or compressed. This is what's known as a perspective effect, not a change in depth of field, and it's something you can use creatively in your compositions. Now let's talk about bokeh, the quality of the background blur. While a shallower depth of field increases background blur, the way that blur looks depends on your lens. Some vintage lenses, like this Carl Zeiss medium format lens, create these pentagon-shaped background highlights because of its aperture blade design. Meanwhile, modern lenses often produce rounder, softer bokeh. Bokeh isn't limited to background highlights, but that's where it's most visible. If you've ever wondered why some background blurs look different, it's not just the amount of blur, it's the lens design itself. To recap, depth of field is controlled by 3 factors: aperture, subject distance, and focal length. If you want a shallow depth of field, use a wider aperture, a longer lens, or get closer. Looking for a deep depth of field, use a smaller aperture, a wider lens, or just step back. And remember, these variables can be combined for the greatest effect. Now it's your turn. Experiment with these settings and see how they change your photos. But before you go out there chasing the shallowest depth of field possible, keep in mind, a blurred background can make your subject really stand out. But if you're not careful, you might end up with part of your subject's face slipping out of focus. And if that happens, remember to use aperture, focal length, and subject distance to get the results you want. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment below. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more photography tips. And if you feel like you need a refresher on how all your camera settings work, make sure to check out this video here. Or here. Somewhere. Anyway, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll see you next time.